lesson is about kanji. The first thing that we're going to do is learn how kanji are put together. So I've titled it Kanji and How to Deal with Them. Let's start with radicals. You may have heard of radicals. Your teachers might have mentioned them. What exactly is a radical? Well, a radical is a component of a kanji. The Japanese word for radical is bushu, and I've given the kanji there on the slide. Actually, a radical itself can be a character, as you're going to see. All kanji, whether you believe it or not, are made up of one or more radicals. Where does this system come from? This system is called the Kangxi radical system. This was invented in China, as you can probably guess by the name Kangxi. There are other systems which we'll get to later in the course, but I'd like to start with this one because this one is really sort of the gold standard. This is the one that most dictionaries use. It's the one that Nelson's uses, modified a little bit, and it's the one that most Chinese dictionaries also use, modified a little bit. I would argue that if you know the Kangxi radical system, you're really able to walk into any library in the world and use most of the reference works there. So this is really a key. It's not just dictionaries, there's lots of reference works that use this system. In the Kangxi system, there are 214 radicals. That may seem like a lot, but actually it isn't really. So let's start here. On the right-hand side of the slide, I have a chart of the 214 radicals. This particular chart comes from the Daikan Majiten, also known as Murahashi's dictionary, which we're going to get to later in the course. Your chart in Nelson's is going to look a little bit different than this, but the 214 radicals are the same, okay? So this chart, first of all, keep in mind it reads from right to left and from top to bottom. So on this chart, note that the radicals are arranged according to how many brush strokes it takes to write each one. Okay? So up here we see 1 brush stroke, 2 brush strokes, 3 brush strokes. So in other words, all the radicals in this box, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them, all have 1 brush stroke. And starting here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. 23 radicals have 2 brush strokes. Now I want to point out something now, and I'll probably point it out again later. In this chart, sometimes you'll see beneath a radical some variation, like you see here, or that you see here. Okay, that is another way in which that particular radical can appear in a character, and you'll see examples of that as we move through today's lesson. Okay. Now, because Chinese and Japanese are not necessarily written in a phonetic style, well, Japanese with kana could be, but certainly Chinese not, this is a convenient way, brushstroke, to organize characters. So let me just digress here for a moment and talk about brushstroke. Unless you've studied calligraphy, even brushstrokes might not be intuitive. Here's an example of the kanji furui, old. Okay. And this particular picture shows us that it has 5 strokes in it. It begins here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, I'll tell you, somebody who doesn't really know characters could easily look at this and say, really? 5? Why isn't it more? For example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At least I know plenty of people who might think that. Now, having studied calligraphy, I can tell you that really the brush strokes are exactly that. In other words, the rule is if your brush leaves the page, then that starts a new brush stroke. So this stroke here, number 4, goes over to the right and then down, and if you've done it correctly, calligraphically, your brush will never have left the page. In all the other strokes, the brush leaves the page. Let's look at another example. Here's Mizu. Here we have stroke 1, and there's a little flip at the bottom, but the brush has not left the page. 2 may look like 2 brush strokes, but again, the brush never leaves the page if you're doing it properly. 3, and here the brush is meant to leave the page. 4. And so Mizu, water, has 4 strokes. Here's the kanji for Nishi. Again, think about when the brush leaves the page. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. It's relatively straightforward. You can find lots of diagrams like this. Here's another example, Minami. I won't walk you through it, but I think you can see how this one has 9 strokes, not 10, not perhaps 11 if you were really stretching it, but it only has 9. And finally, Mon, as in gate, has 12 strokes. It has lots of angles in it. Up here, number 2, number 6, number 10, that kind of weave around. Okay? So brushstroke is really important. I'm going to keep coming back to that throughout the semester. If you don't understand how to count brushstrokes, you really can't use dictionaries very effectively. It doesn't even matter if you're using a dictionary that has the Kangxi radical system or some other radical. They're still based on this idea, this calligraphic idea of the number of brushstrokes. There are a whole lot of dictionaries and web pages that'll give you the stroke order of a kanji. They're usually limited to the sorts of kanji that, say, 6th graders, elementary school students know, or middle school students know. But sometimes they can help you on your way, make this intuitive for you. I'm going to end this show and open up a page which I already had open as an example. This is a page that gives you the stroke order of the kanji, and also conveniently tells you which chapter of which textbook that kanji comes from. So here we see the character for tsuchi, as in earth or dirt. This is in chapter 4 of the textbook Genki. You have some other choices here. There's yokoso, minna no nihongo, and nakama. Right? And it has an animated version of the character and also a static version of the character to show you the brushstroke. I know it seems perhaps nitpicky to say that brushstroke is so important, but I think once you learn the dictionaries, you'll realize just why these are so important. So let's return to our lesson about the radicals. So here we have our chart again on the right-hand side. One of the things you might have noticed is that the radicals might look familiar to you because they themselves are characters. So, for example, the character for wood, I'm going to give myself a pen here, this kanji here, appears on the chart as its own radical. This one, take, for bamboo, also appears on the chart as its own radical. And of course, Nichi, as in Nihon. Here we have that character as its own as a radical. But of course, there are also radicals that are not characters all on their own, and I've chosen one example here. This one might be familiar to you. It's used in this character, tatsu, to build, and here it appears on the chart. So you've got a mixture of different possibilities here. Now, how do you identify these radicals? This is an important skill, and it's not something that you can learn overnight. It really can only be developed through practice, and it won't even happen in a week. It won't even happen in a month. You have to be patient with yourself, but I cannot emphasize enough how important it is. So, here's how to approach it. Lots of dictionaries try to describe it. I'm going to try and give you the simplest description I can. First of all, think of the kanji as sitting on a grid, and on that grid there's a top part, a bottom part, a right part, and a left part. You should look at those different quadrants and or the side, the top, the bottom, and find the radical. So, for example, here we have a character where the radical is on the left-hand side. Here we have a character where the radical is on the right-hand side. I'll come back to that in just a second. Here it's at the top. Here it's at the bottom. And here's on the upper left. Sometimes it's called the northwest. And here it's on the left down or southwest side. Now you may be asking yourself, wait a minute, how do I know, for example, in the case of this radical, this character up here, the top one in the middle, how do I know that the radical is that part on the right and not the part on the left? This is really that intuitive section of the whole exercise. With time, you'll learn that this particular right-hand side radical is more common and more likely, I suppose you could say, as a suspect in this particular character. We'll come back to that. Okay, so what are the main steps to identifying the radical? I kind of like Nelson's dictionary's approach to this is 12 steps, and I think 12 steps is just a few too many. I start to blank out after 6, so I'm going to give you a shorter version, and I think this version still works. First, you ask yourself where the radical is. Is it on the top? Is it on the bottom? Is it on the left and the right? Is it all around? Okay. And then you ask yourself what the radical is. Once you've decided, for example, this is one of those characters, those kanji that can be broken up between a right side and a left side, then you say, okay, which side is it that is the radical? And there is a ordered way in which you should approach this as follows. Step 1, and this is the total common rookie error. Never forget to ask yourself, is the character a radical all on its own? The most common mistake I see students make is they look at a character and they start to try and pick it apart without realizing that the character itself is considered a radical. I don't know why Kangxi made these decisions, and I'm not one to argue with him. I'm just telling you about the system. So, for example, this kanji, this kanji, this kanji, you should all know this one. This one's kuruma, right? This one, shita, tongue. This one, sakana, fish. Those, you could look at them and think, oh, maybe I could break those apart. You could maybe break them apart, but they are radicals on their own. And I've circled them over here on the right-hand side on the chart. There are some characters that are just downright tricky. So, for example, Tatsu, dragon, and Kame, turtle, and Hana, nose. Those are so complex, and if you look down at the bottom of the chart, you'll see that Hana has 14 strokes in it, right? Dragon, Tatsu, and Kame, turtle, both have 16 strokes in them. Who would think that a radical would have 16 strokes? But it can happen, so never forget, the first thing you should ask yourself is the character a radical all on its own? If the answer to that question really is no, and the next question you need to ask yourself is the radical on the left-hand side of the character? The left hand tends to be sort of a more dominant choice. Okay? It's not always the left when you're dealing with a left-right character, but more often than not, it is. These are probably the easiest radicals to identify. They usually kind of just jump off the page at you. So, for example, this kanji, matsu, to wait, or motsu, to have, or this one, samurai, samurao, to serve. They all have the same right-hand part, but they have a left-hand part that differs. It's the left-hand part that's the radical. These radicals are really good examples also of how the shape of a radical, as I was mentioning earlier, can change from what I'm going to call the full character form. So this particular radical is actually, it's over here in the chart, it's a 4-stroke radical because originally it's te, as in hand. And then in its sort of abbreviated or a slightly smaller form, it ends up losing a stroke. Yet, don't forget, originally it had 4 strokes. And so when you look for it on the chart, you need to look under the 4-stroke section, which begins over here and then continues along this whole row and then this row over here. Okay? Now, some dictionaries, like Nelson's, will actually give you the cross-reference. This particular one, this chart that I got from this dictionary, doesn't do it. So I wanted to give you a little bit of warning about that. We'll see how Nelson's handles it later on in another lesson. All right. Similarly, this character, this kanji for person, hito, looks like this when it's abbreviated. Now, it doesn't lose a stroke, but it does look significantly different. Step 3, you should ask yourself, is the radical on the right-hand side of the character? So not the left, but the right. And here's some common kanji, common right-hand side radicals. A warning that I'll give you right now is that it's really easy to mistake this with this. In their abbreviated forms, they look downright identical, but they're not actually. And I've circled them over here on the chart. You can see they're not even the same total number of brush strokes. This particular radical in its full form is this. And this radical, which is on the right, appears on the right, in its full form is that. The fourth question that you need to ask yourself is the radical on the top of the character? Typical characters that have top radicals include these and these. The fifth question, is the radical on the bottom of the character? Think of them as feet, okay? Here we have 2 feet, 4 dots, that's the heart, right? This actually here is fire. It's a version of fire, as we see over here on the chart. And here again we have 2 strokes, and then finally more, which is actually a shell. In this case, it's kind of tricky because the lines go in the other direction. Step 6, ask yourself, is the radical a northwest enclosure? That's what Nelson's calls it, a northwest enclosure. There's a Japanese term for these things, and I'm going to give that to you in another lesson. Examples of characters that have northwest radicals are here on the slide, and you can see them also on the right-hand side in the chart. Step 7, ask yourself, is the radical a southwest enclosure? And again, here are some examples of southwest enclosures. Southwest enclosures are a little bit tricky because if you look at, for example, this one, you might say, well, it doesn't look like southwest, it just looks like left-right. And I would agree with you, but again, this is how the system has been set up, and it's been this way for centuries. The last question, is the radical, actually this is the second last question, is the radical a total enclosure? This is a pretty big catch-all category. There are some that are pretty obvious, like kuchi, a box that surrounds a character. That seems like an enclosure. But actually, mon, down here, is also considered an enclosure, even though you might argue, well, it's kind of open on the bottom, but it really is seen as an enclosure. Or this, ku, which means a ward, like a section of a city. Looks like it's open on the right, but it's still considered an enclosure. Nelson's breaks this down into separate categories, but I really don't think it's necessary, and traditionally that's not how the Japanese look at them. All right, the last thing to keep in mind, the hardest radicals to identify are not those that I mentioned at the beginning, that are multiple strokes and radicals all on their own. Those are tricky, but the hardest ones to identify are the one-stroke radicals. Now, the new Nelson's has a cross-universal index that will help you with this, and we'll get to that later on. If you're using a more traditional dictionary, then you might have to do a little more legwork. Sometimes it's really hard to pick that one stroke out of the pile. And one dictionary to the next may differ in its opinion of how that character should be categorized. So, for example, this character, sawayaku, is categorized in Nelson's under this one-stroke radical. But traditionally, for example, in the Daikanwa Jiten, which is what we're looking at on the right-hand side of this screen, that character is categorized under that particular radical with 4 strokes. All right. The next lesson will be on radical categories.